Hello, thanks for joining today's Real Story Group webinar on customer data platform marketplace trends. This is an exciting area that we've been following for the past couple of years, and our founder Tony Byrne is going to be walking us through some of the latest trends and what to keep an eye on in this particular marketplace. My name is Scott Dill. I'm on the business development team here with Real Story Group, and really want to thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us for this presentation. It'll be about a half hour in length, and we will have time for questions at the end. So if you have questions or feedback that you'd like to share, you can enter those into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. You'll also be able to access the slides for today's presentation once those are available on our site within the next couple of days. So keep an eye out for a follow-up email from our marketing team. And then to our subscribers on the line, you'll be able to have access to this webinar in your subscriber library. So just wanted to give you a quick little bit of background about Real Story Group in terms of the markets we cover. As you'll see from our famous or infamous subway map, we are focused on omni-channel technology vendors, and we cover areas such as web content management, digital asset management, etc. But today we're going to focus on that orange line, which is customer data platforms. We evaluate about 27 vendors in this particular space, and the approach that we take to the research is detailing what their vendors are good at, and perhaps more importantly, what they're not so good at and where they could fall short for you. And the approach that we take is different from other analyst firms in that we don't rank the best or worst vendors per se, but rather what's going to be the right fit for what it is you're trying to do. And so, like I said, today we're going to focus on the orange line customer data platforms. And for some further information on that, here's our founder, Tony Byrne. Tony?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Scott. Just a little story here at the beginning. I founded Real Story Group almost 20 years ago, originally as CMS Watch, largely in reaction to this diagram that you see on the left. We were implementing technologies that were supposed to be in the magic or winning quadrant, and realized that many of these vendors actually had serious problems, and decided that there had to be a better way to tell the real story around what might make a good fit for you or not. And so started an analyst firm that was really focused on not what's the best and worst vendors generically, but really taking a hard look at strengths and weaknesses so that you can identify what's the best fit for you. And we realized early on that if we were going to take a truly tough review of these different tools, that we had to be completely independent. So unlike any other analyst firm that I know of in the world, we do not help or support vendors at all. We don't consult with them. We don't speak at their events. We don't accept a cup of coffee for them. We don't write white papers. We don't let them quote us in their press releases. And it turns out this is a fairly unique model in the analyst world, but I think you'll see over the next 20 minutes or so that gives us a very truly independent and hard-hitting look at these technologies and what might work for you, and quite frankly, what's simply a lot of hype. So let's get into it. The CDP marketplace, changing very rapidly. I'm going to share 5 trends with you that we think are particularly germane as we come towards the last quarter of 2019. So the first one is that we're beginning to see the emergence of a new stack model. I think this model is a reference model. We're not here yet. This is more of a model for the 2020s, but CDPs need to be understood in a kind of broader context where we're trying to liberate certain services, data services, content services, personalization, decisioning, coordination, to liberate those from this content and engagement management stack here in the middle: service and support, CRM, social engagement, email marketing, WCM, and so forth. That's where a lot of those data, content, and rules are living now. And what we're seeing as a trend, although again at the very earliest stages, is this idea of moving some of these services into more channel agnostic, what we call enterprise foundation services. And so if you see down here in the lower right, customer data platforms in the orange box are one piece of a larger picture, although arguably a really important piece, maybe initially the most important thing to do, which is to essentially liberate your data from all the different channels and all the back office systems and get into a single place where that you can then reason against it and act on it in a very more customer focused way, and to have more coherent, customer experiences across omni-channel touch points in any given journey. So CDPs are a very important part of this, but it's part of really a larger trend, where we're moving services lower in the stack, so that you still have some channel specific services up here in the content and engagement management layer around contextualization, assembly, delivery, and interaction. But enterprise-wide, you're going to have core content, core data, core insights, orchestration, personalization, all that happening at a more channel agnostic way. And again, there's a reason why we put core data first, because that's the most important thing to remove from individual channels and really create a kind of a unified store against which you can then do all sorts of interesting things as you go out and engage customers and prospects. So this is the first trend, still very early days for this trend, but the customer data platform is maybe the sort of premier example of technology shifting for this new world. So the key takeaway here for trend number one is that CDPs, whether you build one or buy one, really critical for the omnichannel world that we're all trying to create for the 2020s. So that's really the first trend. The second trend that we're seeing is a widening set of CDP use cases. So this is really interesting phenomenon that we've seen emerge, is businesses justifying CDPs for a wide variety of different rationales. And I'm not going to argue that one of these is necessarily more important than the other. The key thing is for you to understand which among these are most important for you. And there's a couple of reasons for that, because the reality is that any CDP vendor is likely to be targeting maybe 2, 3, 4 of these scenarios, maybe adequate at 1, 2, 3 of the others. So whenever a vendor tells you, yeah, we can do all 9 of these things, chances are they are a jack of many trades and probably a master of none. And so you really want to be thinking about prioritizing one of the things that we're looking to do on day one with a unified customer data store, and then have that drive you in terms of identifying what's a plausible set of vendors. What's interesting about this is that the scope is definitely been widening, and so we're even seeing a case, my colleague at Poor wrote a blog about this, about a couple of companies that we debriefed who actually had 2 CDP solutions, right? So I'm not going out here and saying, well, you should go out and license multiple CDPs. That may or may not be useful for you. I would say certainly start with one and then go from there. But it's a really indicative of the wide possibility, the wide breadth of potential services that an organization might be looking for in this technology. I mean, certainly there are a couple of sort of canonical things that have been driving a lot of hype in this marketplace. One is, just segmenting as kind of a basic thing to be able to do either manually or dynamically in your CDP. And this obviously should be, a basic service that you should be looking for. Different vendors do this in different ways. Some are more usable than others. So, there's obviously a lot of room for testing here, but segmenting is clearly kind of a baseline sort of capability that you need, to execute on certainly at least the more activation-oriented scenarios. And then, of course, the thing that we see very often is to be able to use this data for outbound customer engagement. This is where marketers, of course, are getting very excited. If you're on the customer services side, maybe this is a little bit less germane, but here's an example where instead of just using the fields that are available to me in my marketing automation platform or my email service provider platform, that I get access to a broader set of enterprise fields to be able to then leverage that data in terms of, for example, the outbound messaging that I'm going to be doing. So these are two fairly common use cases. What's interesting that we've seen, and so this is kind of trend number 3, is this kind of revival of the original concept of CDPs when they first started showing up on the landscape 7 years ago, and even when people were building homegrown ones. This notion of advanced customer data management being an important use case. And this is really an interesting phenomenon, along with predictive analytics and other sorts of modeling. So why is this? I think part of it is that even though most enterprises that we see looking at CDPs already have a data warehouse, may already have multiple data warehouses already have one or more data lakes. What they don't always have is this notion of a data mart for their marketing and customer experience oriented data that then can be manipulated and massaged in a more front-facing sort of way. You might call this, the democratization of analytics, and people outside of the enterprise data science group wanting to be able to manipulate and manage this data in a way that is very specific to their marketing use cases, as opposed to more enterprise-wide use cases. But we're definitely seeing a kind of a revival of this. So while many CDPs during this last 5 years of expansion have been really focused a lot on activation-oriented use cases, some of the sexier stuff that certainly can help drive revenue and engagement, we're also seeing renewed interest in just basic data management and being able to clean and normalize and organize this data and then manipulate it in a way more effectively to do more sort of targeted sorts of engagement when it comes time to actually activate it. So the fourth trend is really interesting, and we're seeing quite a bit of it, which is CDPs are everywhere. And this isn't necessarily a good thing, particularly if you're a larger enterprise that wants to separate concerns. So what you're looking at here is a journey orchestration engine. It happens to come from the vendor Infor. Infor is not unique in this respect, in as much as they kind of bundle a lightweight CDP and have CDP-like services with it, right, with the orchestration engine. You can see why that might be, that these two might travel together. And so the problem is that at this point, your CDP is kind of bound to your journey orchestration engine, as opposed to being an independent component in your stack that other services might need unmediated access to it, and not necessarily your journey orchestration engine, right? So in an ideal world, you separate these two. Now, by the same token, we see CDP vendors trying to build in orchestration services themselves. And again, if you don't already have a journey orchestration engine, maybe that's not a bad thing to be able to play with it. But particularly if you're a larger enterprise, you really do want to think about separating concerns. So that's just one example where you have journey orchestration engines trying to bundle CDP services. But really, we're seeing it all across the stack. I mean, if we start in the upper left here, certainly we see advertising systems and DSPs, and certainly even sometimes DMPs, try to serve as your definitive customer data platform. Obviously, you don't want to do that. They're bound to a particular channel. DMPs are also, of course, very limited in terms of the types of information that they can hold. But the idea being here, look, we're an engagement system. We want to have access to authoritative data, so just build it within our system, right? And we believe that's kind of a trap, that you've been spending all of this time basically trying to liberate all of your data and from all these different systems and put it in a unified place. And now many of these vendors who have sell these engagement systems are saying, basically, come back to jail, right? And you don't want to go back to jail. But we're seeing this all the way along, certainly in service and support systems, very much in CRM systems and Salesforce automation. For many B2B organizations, that is their de facto CDP. That may work for a small subset, but the reality is you really almost never want to use your CRM as your CDP platform. It tends to be very limited, tends to have a very relational model, tends to be very bad at identity resolution, device stitching, all sorts of other issues. Can have serious performance issues with respect to integration. Even Salesforce has some sort of old school ways of doing things, so not a good place for your CDP. Likewise, for many of you, your CDP today is de facto your email and marketing automation platform, maybe where you have all of your marketing data. Some of these vendors are encouraging you to basically double down on that by building extended data models in that environment. You really don't want to do that. Among other things, this precludes you from getting access to other enterprise data sets that might be useful as you're building segments or trying to define logic, or for that matter, embedding certain data elements into your outbound messaging. Likewise, we see WCM platforms sometimes rebranded as digital experience platforms, like Acquia and Sitecore and others, who, although they may not call it a CDP, effectively are saying, look, use us as your customer data mart. We'll build up all of this behavioral information, and then you can reason against that for personalization and even outbound messaging. And again, this is just data that's been effectively siloed in a place that's not really all that well designed to serve as an enterprise repository. Mentioned, as we go down here, journey orchestration and decisioning. Most of the vendors are pretty clear that you shouldn't use them as a CDP, but yet they do have customer data mart services, so you need to be careful there. Finally, in the analytics realm, in particular, some of the data enrichment vendors are suggesting that if you don't have a proper CDP, they can effectively build one for you. You don't want to do that. And even sometimes we see customers looking at customer identity and access management and saying, hey, if I've got core profile information here, particularly around authorization, and it's a unified record, maybe I should just extend it and use that as my CDP. And obviously there's very strong limits for that. It's not really meant to be an integration environment. Typically don't support highly extensive extensible data models, and so that's not a good place either. So, the trend number 4 is that all these other vendors are popping up and saying, look, we'll give you CDP-like services, and I would argue that you really want to be disciplined, get your customer data into a unified repository, whether you purchase one or you build a data mart yourself, and then feed all of these different systems the data that they need. So that's trend number 4. I'll remind you that once again, we'll have time for questions at the end. So if you have any questions or comments, anything you want to disagree with, anything you want to affirm from your own experience on any of these, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll be happy to address it at the end. So trend number 5, this has been a trend for some time. I'm repeating it now because there's a lot of noise around this, and that is that smaller vendors remain ascendant. So this is what analysts call a highly fragmented marketplace. There's a number of different vendors here. It's seen close to $1 billion in venture and other investments over the last 10 years. Those investments continue this year. We're seeing new entrants into the marketplace. We're seeing existing entrants, double down on their investments. And so really interesting marketplace in that respect. It's still growing both in terms of the number of players and the sophistication of the different solutions. Now, having said all that, certainly among the major suite vendors, Adobe, what was IBM, now Acoustic, Oracle, Salesforce, SAP, they've all announced one way or another CDP plans. I think this was designed essentially to preempt the marketplace and cause customers to slow their decision making, because the reality is that these vendors, none of them today actually have a CDP you can sell. Even Adobe, which has been talking about this for some time, has had some beta customers for some time, really is not ready yet to go to market. And I suspect that when these first come out, you're going to see a number of different things. One, that they're probably surprisingly immature solutions, and 2, that they're likely to be bound more closely to their existing engagement silos as opposed to being truly enterprise-wide. So I tend to believe, based on all the research that we've done, that the suite vendors are likely to remain immature for some time, not just quarters, but we're probably talking years. And so if you're sitting around waiting for them, that's probably not a good strategy. Now, if you're not ready to jump into the pool, that's a separate issue, right? You may have your own reasons why you don't want to select packaged CDP technology, and there's any number of different reasons why you might not. Then that's one thing. But if you're waiting for these big 5 to mature, but you have needs today, I would suggest maybe thinking about prototyping with a more best-of-breed solution instead, and then potentially, pausing whether you're going to make a big commitment or not. But there's some interesting kind of themes in this marketplace fall out of this. I think one, as I mentioned, it's still expanding. The suite vendors again remain somewhat parochial and incomplete. The pure play vendors, where a lot of the action is at, they tend to be smaller vendors. I think the ones that we evaluate range in size from about 80 employees to maybe 400 employees. They're clearly not as mature as some of the others, and some sorts, as you might see in some other marketplaces. So, for example, They tend to be fairly slow in terms of building channel partnerships. They tend to be slow in terms of building community type services, which are really critical for the long-term longevity of any technology. So while I'm suggesting that you ought to seriously consider the pure play vendors, I'm not in the same breath saying that these vendors, it's going to be an easy ride with them. You need to work with them as you would work with any other sort of quasi startups. What is interesting that's happening among some of the pure play vendors is some specialization, as you would expect in a marketplace this big. There's definitely been some regional specialization, which is interesting. And obviously there's some special issues in Europe and to a lesser extent Asia Pac that some vendors have kind of glommed onto. We're also seeing greater vertical specialization. So some vendors really kind of like some of the DMP vendors before them, thinking hard about particular verticals, be it media, retail, obviously very popular, e-commerce, professional services, manufacturing, and so forth, thinking hard about the particular issues that are confronted in some of those, and building up, if not always in their technology, certainly very often in their professional services expertise. And that's important because, once again, although these vendors talk a good game about having systems integration partners, they don't always build out a deep channel, and you very often are dependent on their professional services. Now, what's interesting about this is that now that IBM has sold off its portfolio here to Acoustic, among some of the big cloud vendors here, so I'm saying IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft are largely absent in this story. They're basically selling cloud services to these other vendors who are then implementing CDPs. So the very largest vendors are largely absent in the package space. Now, what we have seen enterprises do is build their own, essentially marketing customer data marts, essentially CDPs, but they're homegrown, and using Azure, AWS, or the IBM cloud to do that. So they're there providing some core infrastructure, but certainly not packaged solutions. So this is just getting at, I think, a little bit of the immaturity I was talking about. If you run the CDP vendors through our Real Quadrant shortlist generator, this is a tool you can try out on our site where basically you plug in some considerations and it generates a shortlist, dynamic shortlist. It's custom just for you. And what's interesting is we took a basket of scenarios and then we looked at the strategic considerations, which is the y-axis. The scenario fit is the x-axis. So we took a basket of scenarios and then we took the standard kind of strategic consideration weightings, and the results were rather saggy, which means that they tend to be south of the equator here. And what that means is just another way of saying that the vendors themselves and their ecosystems are somewhat immature, right? So you're going to see, at least in the way that we do this, where scenario fit and functionality is on the x-axis and strategic consideration, vendor and ecosystem intangibles are on the y-axis, that, vendors may shift left or right, but they're going to tend to show up, kind of south in a southerly kind of weighting here. And that's just a visual way of showing the comparative immaturity of this marketplace, say, relative to something like marketing automation, web content management, CRM, where some of the vendors and their ecosystems have become quite mature, and where you're going to see them, some of the dots move a little bit further north. Okay, if you're thinking about selecting a CDP, always want to remind you that you should not focus on actual features as others may encourage you to do, but to do a more hands-on, agile approach that's based on use cases with a team that's very test-based, iterating as you learn about your real requirements as opposed to what you think your requirements are, and then taking a more adaptive approach. Certainly this book that my colleague Jared and I wrote can help you there. And so if you're looking at CDPs, I would also commend you to another recorded webinar on our site, which is how to select a CDP. Anyway, here are the key takeaways, and then we'll definitely have some time for questions. So again, CDPs foundational in an omni-channel stack strategy. There's a wide variety of use cases now, and you'll want to prioritize them just for your own sanity and make sure that you match up with the right vendors. But then keep in mind that that you're probably going to have some intense data management needs no matter what. avoid building customer data marts or CDPs in other package platforms like WCM or CRM. The CDP marketplace is likely to remain fragmented for some time, so the market is not going to tell you itself which one you should go with. These are decisions you're going to have to make, and certainly we can help you filter. We believe the large vendors are going to continue to lag, and that they're likely to continue to lag over several years. But in any kind of selection process, you definitely want to take a more agile-oriented process that features adaptive testing that has you try before you buy, even if that's kind of labor-intensive on your end, just to make sure you've got the right fit. So our mission in life with Real Story Group is to help this persona, Stacy, the stack owner. She's responsible for the marketing and CX stack. She gets a lot of questions, many of which I think might have even come up in today's webinar. And our goal in life is to help Stacy, shield her from all this and help her give the right answers to her colleagues. And so if that's you on the line here and you think that you could use a trusted advisor to help you navigate your omni-channel stack, certainly look forward to chatting with you further. The way that we do this is we have 3 subscription offerings. One is just a vendor selection advisory where you have access to all of our CDP research, including all of the tough calls and judgments that we make on a scenario basis for all the different vendors. Some of you may want to license all of our research and be able to get advisory across your entire stack, and as I say, really support Stacy in her job of trying to manage that whole stack. And a subset of you that may then want to join our private executive leadership council, which just met in September, is going to be meeting in June. Very interesting things coming out of that. So some questions are starting to come in. I'll invite others. Scott, if you want to just talk briefly about next steps.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. And as Tony mentioned, you can try before you buy when it comes to CDPs, but we also recommend that you try before you buy when it comes to Real Story Group's research. And what we mean by that is you can download excerpts from our research at any time on CDPs or any other markets that we cover. And if you'd like, we can also actually take you on a behind-the-scenes tour of the Real Story Group subscriber experience to give you really an understanding of, if you were to subscribe, what will be available to you? What do those tools look like to create a custom shortlist or compare the vendors side by side? In terms of webinars, our next one is scheduled for October 30th. We'll be shifting gears and taking a look at the web content management marketplace, some of the billionaire behemoths like Acquia, Sitecore, WordPress, and how that marketplace has been changing. So hope you can join us for that. And looks like a couple questions have popped in. So Tony, if you want to take those.
Sure. Are you seeing any unique or advantage capabilities? This is from Greg. Thanks, Greg. Are you seeing any unique advantage capabilities from Salesforce, Adobe, Acoustic CDP, or are they more Me Too playing catch up? It's tough to know. They each have some advantages given some of the adjacent capabilities they have and some of the integration tool sets that they have inherited or licensed. Having said that, I think they tend to be more Me Too, and they want to fit these rather than looking at it as a sort of unique problem in an enterprise stack. I think they're trying to fit it into their own stack, and that's the part that has me a little bit suspicious, is that the pressures that are going to be brought to bear, not just by their incumbent product owners across adjacent tools, but even their incumbent customer set, I think may limit the scope and depth of what these vendors can apply at first. So what you're hearing from us is really some skepticism about their offerings, not the least of which in the past, all 3 of those vendors have sometimes talked about things that don't really exist or have been out in front of their skis in terms of what their tools actually do relative to what their marketing does. So in any case, let's see, we've got one more question here, and this is someone, Jessica's asking about Microsoft and Microsoft Adobe. So Microsoft and Adobe and some other vendors have been working on a kind of information object interchange framework, which certainly is useful. It has been talked about a little bit more than implemented, but definitely worth tracking, but in and of itself doesn't really provide any unique capabilities, particularly as far as customer data management per se. Obviously, any kind of interop is useful. The history of trying to build data models around these that really stretch has not been particularly strong, and so I tend to look at that initiative more as a kind of nice PR thing rather than something that's going to bring a lot of value to customers, particularly because Salesforce is not on board. And we know that one of the key issues really is integrating Adobe and Salesforce. So great. So we've run over time. Thanks, folks, for checking in. Always a pleasure to spend a little time with you, even if it's virtual. So for Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne, wishing you a great rest of your week and signing off for Real Story Group. Thanks again. Bye now.